Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
Madeline Coleman covers Formula One for The Athletic. Madeline, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for hopping on with us. So the big story we wanted to talk to you about was the 2024 schedule that just dropped yesterday. There's a couple pretty significant changes. What are they for those that are not familiar in our audience? And then why do you think ultimately Formula One made these changes?
Well, first off, more than happy to be here. Some of the biggest changes is that we're going to see more Saturday night races because of Ramadan. So both the Bahrain Grand Prix and Saudi Arabian Grand Prix are going to be on Saturdays next season because Ramadan starts the Monday after Saudi Arabia. That's one of the bigger changes. And then you'll see Japan jumped from late in the fall all the way to sometime during the spring instead. And that's pretty notable, but it could be expected because during the fall, it's more of kind of difficult weather. I believe it was in 2019, they had a threat of a typhoon come through, and there was a lot of rainfall during that time. But the biggest note is that, F1 is working towards regionalizing the calendar. They want to be able to get more of the European races together, kind of part of their plan to be net zero carbon by 2030. And so those are kind of like the bigger changes. However, as part of that, you see the sport also expanding, and China is coming back onto the calendar because they've dropped their COVID-19 zero policy. And that race is, I believe the contract is until expires in 2025. And so it's coming back onto the calendar for the first time since the global pandemic began.
So you got that race added back in. Obviously, there's two more races in the U.S. now, with Miami debuting last year, Vegas debuting later. So you have this incredibly long schedule now for the first time next year. I mean, it's been growing, but the longest one they've ever had. How do people inside Formula One feel about that?
Speaking for the media and the drivers, because today is media day before the British Grand Prix, so we heard a few of the drivers talk about the schedule. I don't want to say anxiety, but as much as we love covering the sport and as much as everyone loves the sport, there's two sides of sustainability. Obviously, there's the environmental aspect of it. However, there's also the mental health and well-being. So that's close to half of the year that these teams and drivers are going to be on the road, and whether they're actually at the track or if they're working back at the factories, they're still going to have to be working in that time zone where the race is happening. So for me, for example, I am based on the East Coast in the U.S. I did not go to Australia this year, but I was working Australian hours while being on the East Coast. So there's still that major shift, and sometimes, like a lesser extent of the jet lag. But then these people are going to be away from their families for extended periods of time. I saw one journalist share that they're expecting their first child, and they're going to miss a big portion of the first year of their child's life because of the schedule. And I think Lando Norris earlier today, he was talking about how the ideal number is probably closer to 20 races because of how many tracks that there are and how much travel comes as part of it. So it's an exciting time to be watching the sports be growing, but at the same time, there's that question of sustainability and how you put, the people first as well.
No doubt. Madeline Coleman's with us from The Athletic, covers Formula One. And like you said, it's not just obviously media, but everyone in the paddock, from team principals on down to mechanics and drivers and everybody that has to kind of go on this crazy road show. As part of that, people move within the sport. Obviously, drivers, most specifically, driver contracts are always negotiated throughout the season, which I always, as someone, by the way, who comes to Formula One as one of the thousands, if not millions, who watch Drive to Survive, but I come to it from someone who's covered American sports. The fact that you're negotiating your next contract during the season, there's not this free agent off-season period, is wild to me. That's a different conversation for another day. But it typically has happened leading up to what we're about to have, which is this summer break. That's kind of a time when a lot of teams try to get their driver lineup for the next season in place. With this new longer schedule and a fall break also being implemented for the first time next year, do you think that changes kind of the free agency of Formula One that's happening in the first half of the season? Does that timeline change next year?
I think it might possibly for some of the drivers that aren't as secure in their seat. There's a lot of contracts that are up at the end of next season, but, summer break is a nice time when there is that mandatory shutdown for 2 weeks where people aren't working. They're able to shut off. But then, management can kind of have those types of conversations when they're not having the races going on. And especially with that fall break, it could help as we get closer to the end of the season. But to be honest, it's kind of a wait and see. I'm very curious about it as well.
Yeah. And do you think the fall break, like what do you think happens during that break as opposed to what's typically gone on during summer break?
I think it'll be similar to how it looked this year with that break after the Australian Grand Prix. Because I believe, if I remember the math correctly, it's around the same lengthwise. So I think it's going to be kind of a shutdown a little bit, but obviously people are going to be back at the factories and working and in the simulator and practicing in that nature, what they're able to do remotely at least. But I do think that for some of those drivers who may not have as much security, depending on how, the rest of the season, beginning of next year shakes out, it's going to be probably more talks, but it's going to be a time when they're able to kind of just slow down a little bit in a very fast-paced world. I think a little bit more of that, mental health and well-being, sustainability conversation would probably be a little bit more at play during that fall break.
Yeah, they will have done a lot by then. We'll see how they feel. Last question here from Madeline Coleman, who covers Formula One for The Athletic. They have a great F1 newsletter, by the way, that you can subscribe to on The Athletic's website. Come to your inbox a couple times a week. But, I mentioned Drive to Survive. It's hard to not, especially in America, talking about F1 these days, because people in the sport talk about it and how that has changed the sport, the growth of where fans are, specifically in the U.S. We've seen 2 U.S. races added. How much of this change in the Formula One schedule and kind of a lot of the bigger changes that are happening in the sport are being driven by a change in who the fans are and where they are?
F1's popularity, boom in popularity, honestly, is the product of kind of a perfect storm of sorts. That was between, the shutdown during the pandemic, right when, a new season of Drive to Survive came out, and then you've got the content creator economy booming. I've spoken with content creator Tony Cohen-Brown a lot about this, about how all three aspects come into play. I believe it was Salesforce who did a study recently that found that only around 1% of F1 fans will be able to go to a race in person in their life. So being able to have that social media aspect is helping with growing in popularity. But as far as Drive to Survive specifically, that's part of what helped bring Las Vegas Grand Prix to the calendar. I spoke with some of the executives, and Drive to Survive was one of the few marketing tools that they had to use because that the race came together during the pandemic. They were with the U.S. borders closed for travel and everything during the shutdown. They weren't able to get different stakeholders or get the London team out to Las Vegas to be able to talk to the Las Vegas stakeholders, to be able to get that together. And so Liberty Media was doing more of the on-the-ground conversations and telling people who didn't know about F1 to go and watch Drive to Survive. And that was kind of the first introduction to it for some people. So it's a powerful tool to be able to use. It's interesting to be able to see how it grows and how the different drivers kind of handle that.
No doubt. Madeline Coleman covers F1 for The Athletic. Madeline, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll definitely talk to you down the line.
Thank you so much.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.